The morning of December 21st, 1944. The frozen forests south of Malmedy, Belgium. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber crouched in his foxhole as American artillery began its morning barrage. He had survived 3 years of war on the Eastern Front, witnessed the destruction of entire divisions at Kursk, and endured countless Soviet bombardments. Nothing had prepared him for this. The shells were exploding above his head, not impacting the ground as they should, not burying themselves in the snow before detonating, but exploding in mid-air with surgical precision, 20 to 30 feet above the earth, showering down a lethal rain of shrapnel that turned his foxhole from sanctuary into death trap. Weber pressed himself flat against the frozen dirt, feeling the hot fragments whistle past his helmet, watching men around him torn apart by steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shrapnel patterns were wrong. Everything about this bombardment was wrong. Traditional artillery airbursts were rare, difficult to execute, requiring perfect timing on mechanical fuses. These shells burst with uncanny consistency, as if they knew exactly when they were close enough to kill. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That morning, examining an unexploded American shell in the pre-dawn darkness before the barrage began, Weber had seen something that defied his understanding of what was possible. The shell's nose contained what appeared to be a complete miniature radio transmitter, roughly the size of a wine bottle, packed with delicate glass vacuum tubes. These fragile components had somehow survived being fired from a gun at forces that should have pulverized them into powder. Wehrmacht engineers had spent a decade concluding such a device was theoretically impossible. The Americans had not only built it, but were manufacturing them by the tens of thousands. This single realization would fundamentally alter German understanding of what America was capable of producing, and by extension, what Germany was facing. The story of how German soldiers came to witness and fear the proximity fuse began not in the forests of Belgium, but in the laboratories and factories of the United States, where in the summer of 1940, a group of American scientists were tasked with solving what every major power had concluded was an impossible problem. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists and engineers under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Among them was Merle Tuve, a physicist whose brilliant but volatile temperament would drive a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The problem they faced was straightforward to state, but seemingly impossible to solve. German and Japanese aircraft were decimating Allied ships and ground forces. Conventional anti-aircraft guns required either a direct hit, which was extraordinarily difficult against a maneuvering target traveling at 300 miles per hour, or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined altitude. In practice, at the start of the war, it required approximately 20,000 shells to down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ranged as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. The concept of a proximity fuse had been considered for decades. Make a fuse that could detect when it approached a target and detonate automatically. Simple in theory, impossible in practice given the technology of the 1930s. Germany had explored proximity fuses as early as 1930, developing over 30 different designs, including acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise and electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces. By 1939, German researchers had concluded technical challenges were insurmountable. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties, though Rheinmetall-Borsig would resume limited work in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The British had reached further. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using a small Doppler radar system. They tested prototypes on rockets, which faced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. But Britain's programme was stymied by two critical obstacles. The cost was astronomical, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking. More fundamentally, they could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still far too delicate to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. The British shared their research through the Tizard mission when America entered the war, but it would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work. The Americans took the British research and did what no other nation could. They actually built it, not a laboratory curiosity, but a mass-produced weapon that could be manufactured by the millions. Tuvey's Section T, at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, established on March 10, 1942 in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was elegant. Making it work was another matter entirely. Consider the engineering challenges. The fuse had to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. Inside this space, engineers had to fit a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All of this had to function in extreme temperatures and survive storage for months. Most daunting of all, it had to withstand the shock of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. Every component experiences a crushing force equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel. And after surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as a founding member, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up, and they were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%, but vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source that would activate only after firing, preventing accidental detonation during storage or handling. Engineers developed a battery using a glass tube filled with electrolyte solution. When the shell was fired, Centrifugal force pushed the solution outward, bringing it into contact with metal electrodes and creating an electrical charge. Before firing, the battery was inert and safe. After firing, it provided power for the few seconds needed. The detonation mechanism required its own innovation. A thyrotron tube, essentially an electronic switch filled with gas, would trigger when the received signal reached threshold intensity. This released electrical charge stored in a capacitor, firing the detonator that set off the main explosive. The entire sequence, from signal reflection to detonation, occurred in milliseconds. Safety mechanisms were paramount. The fuse had to remain completely inert until fired, preventing accidents during assembly, transport, and loading. Multiple redundant systems ensured the fuse could not detonate prematurely. The centrifugal battery provided one layer of safety. A mechanical safety pin that withdrew only after sufficient spin provided another. The radio circuitry itself was designed to reach operating conditions only under the specific acceleration and rotation profiles of being fired. Mass production presented challenges as significant as the engineering. To equip American forces adequately, factories would need to produce millions of fuses. Each fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. Every component had to meet exacting specifications. A single defective vacuum tube or capacitor would render the entire fuse useless. 87 different firms using 110 factories were eventually engaged in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati became one of 5 final assembly plants. Sylvania Electric Products manufactured the miniature vacuum tubes. Western Electric, Raytheon, and dozens of other companies produced specific components. The scale of coordination required was unprecedented for an electronics program. Quality control demanded revolutionary approaches. Before the proximity fuse program, electronics manufacturing was essentially craft work. Skilled technicians hand-built each unit. Mass production of complex electronics at wartime scales required breaking construction into simple, repeatable tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Women who had never touched electronic equipment before the war learned to solder miniature components, test vacuum tube characteristics, and assemble fuse bodies with precision measuring in thousandths of an inch. The workforce training programs demonstrated that complex technical work could be performed by people without advanced education, given proper training and supervision. At the Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, women assembled miniature vacuum tubes in conditions of strict secrecy. They were told they were working on radio components. The actual purpose remained classified. Some workers handled beryllium in the soldering process without understanding its health risks, a tragic oversight in an otherwise remarkable program. By September 1942, the first accepted fuses came off production lines. The Navy immediately allocated them to the Pacific Fleet, where desperate need for improved anti-aircraft defense overrode concerns about the technology falling into enemy hands. Use was strictly limited to overwater engagements, where even a dud shell would sink harmlessly into the ocean, beyond enemy recovery. On January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the light cruiser Helena, achieved the first combat kill with a proximity-fused shell. Operating off Guadalcanal, Helena's crew engaged Japanese Val dive bombers attacking the task force. Cochrane fired 3 shells at a distant aircraft that had just completed its bombing run. All 3 shells burst near the target. The Val fell into the ocean. The proximity fuse had drawn first blood. The psychological impact on American crews was immediate. For years, anti-aircraft gunners had fired thousands of rounds with minimal results. Engaging aircraft was an exercise in frustration, watching tracers arc past targets, knowing that even perfect aim might not place shells close enough to damage maneuvering aircraft. The proximity fuse transformed their effectiveness overnight. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition began demonstrating kill rates that seemed impossible. During the Solomon Islands campaign in early 1943, Admiral William Halsey's task forces came under repeated night attacks by Japanese Betty bombers carrying torpedoes. Anti-aircraft batteries equipped with proximity fuses achieved such high kill rates that surviving Japanese pilots reported facing impossibly accurate defensive fire. The fuses were credited with 50% of enemy aircraft destroyed by the fleet, even though only 25% of ammunition issued had proximity fuses. This meant that proximity-fused shells were destroying aircraft at approximately 3 times the rate of conventional ammunition. Against kamikaze attacks, the difference became even more pronounced. Suicide pilots flying directly toward ships provided optimal targets for proximity fuses, which detonated when aircraft entered lethal radius. The USS Cleveland demonstrated the fuse's capability in early August 1942 during test firings in Chesapeake Bay, destroying 3 drone aircraft with proximity bursts. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted in June 1944, proximity fuses proved decisive. Over 2 days, American task forces faced waves of Japanese aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire brought down over 500 attacking planes. Proximity fuses were credited with the majority of kills. Dr. James Van Allen, the physicist who had developed the rugged vacuum tubes, was aboard the battleship Washington during the engagement. He watched proximity-fused shells from his own creation detonate around incoming kamikaze aircraft, preventing what could have been catastrophic damage to the American fleet. The irony was not lost on him that his work in miniaturized electronics, born from desperate military necessity, might have saved his own life. But the Navy's success created tension. Army Air Force's leadership feared proximity fuse technology falling into enemy hands on land. They argued strenuously against using the fuses in Europe or over any territory where unexploded shells might be recovered. When a Navy ship fired proximity-fused shells during the July 1943 Battle of Gela in Sicily, and one dud shell landed on the beach, the headquarters immediately dispatched a special patrol to locate and retrieve the fuse. The secrecy surrounding the program was absolute. Workers at assembly plants didn't know what they were building. Sailors firing the shells at sea were told only that they had new, more effective ammunition. Even the code name was deliberately misleading. The fuses were designated VT for variable time, suggesting they were simply improved mechanical time fuses rather than revolutionary electronic devices. This security emphasis created operational constraints that frustrated commanders in the field. Throughout 1943 and most of 1944, American forces in Europe watched German aircraft attack while knowing they possessed ammunition that could dramatically improve their defensive capability, but were forbidden from using it. The policy was absolute: no proximity fuses over land where they might be captured. The restriction began to crack in June 1944, when Germany launched its V-1 flying bomb campaign against London. The small, fast, unmanned aircraft proved extremely difficult to intercept. British anti-aircraft guns using conventional ammunition achieved kill rates below 25%. The Vosne II were devastating London, and conventional defences were inadequate. Winston Churchill personally intervened, demanding access to American proximity fuses. After intensive discussions, American military leadership agreed to limited deployment. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned along the English coast, where dud shells would fall harmlessly into the sea. British gunners equipped with proximity-fused ammunition began engaging the Vosne II in mid-June 1944. The results were spectacular. Within weeks, kill rates climbed from 24% to nearly 80%. By the end of August, British anti-aircraft units equipped with proximity fuses were destroying 79% of incoming Vosne II. The proximity fuses had saved London from a weapon that might otherwise have forced evacuation of the city. Still, the Army restriction held for ground use in Europe. commanders protested. The fuses had proven themselves against aircraft. Their potential against ground forces was obvious. Shells detonating 20 to 50 feet above ground would spread shrapnel over wide areas, devastating infantry in the open and making foxholes and trenches death traps rather than shelters. The breakthrough came in December 1944, when Germany launched its final major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th with a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. American forces, thinly spread across what had been considered a quiet sector, reeled under the assault. German tanks and infantry pushed westward, creating a dangerous bulge in Allied lines. Early on the morning of December 16th, the commander of the U.S. 406th Artillery Group, Colonel George Axelson, faced an impossible decision. Early on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the commander of the U.S. 406th Artillery Group, Colonel George Axelson, faced an impossible decision. The Germans had just launched the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and one of their first targets was the 38th Cavalry Squadron, dug in around Monschau, Germany. The lightly armed cavalry troopers desperately needed artillery support. Axelson had just received shipments of proximity-fused shells, still under strict orders not to use them over land. He watched German forces advancing. He knew his conventional ammunition would be far less effective. He knew that men would die because he was following orders designed to protect a technological secret. The emergency, Axelson decided, trumped the restrictions. He ordered his gunners to load the proximity fuses. Minutes later, rounds equipped with the new fuses began exploding directly over the heads of advancing German soldiers. The attack collapsed. Stunned survivors fell back, reporting impossible artillery fire that burst above them with uncanny accuracy. For the Germans, this was their first encounter with a weapon that would fundamentally change their understanding of American capabilities. 3 days later, on December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested permission to use proximity fuses without restriction in the European theatre. The German offensive was gaining momentum. American forces needed every advantage. On December 21st, all restrictions were lifted. The proximity fuse was unleashed on the European battlefield. The timing was catastrophic for German forces. SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade, 150, equipped with captured American vehicles and German tanks disguised as American armor, was preparing to attack the town of Malmedy. American artillery battalions supporting the town's defense opened fire with proximity-fused shells. The effect was devastating beyond anything Skorzeny's veterans had experienced. Shells burst above their formations with methodical precision. Shrapnel rained down from angles that foxholes and trenches couldn't protect against. Men crouching behind cover found themselves exposed to fragments coming from directly overhead. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had survived Soviet artillery barrages and Katyusha rocket attacks, reported that nothing compared to the helplessness of facing American proximity-fused fire. So unnerved were some of Skorzeny's troops that they charged directly into the artillery fire, shouting, "Kamerad," the German word for comrade, used when surrendering. They preferred immediate capture to enduring another moment under the airbursts. By December 23rd, American intelligence estimated that proximity-fused rounds had killed as many as 2,000 German soldiers around Malmedy alone. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army's relief effort, toward the besieged town of Bastogne, wrote enthusiastically to the War Department about the new ammunition. On the night of December 25th and 26th, his artillery caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River. A single concentrated bombardment with proximity fuses killed by actual count 702 enemy soldiers. Patton's message was characteristically blunt. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German army quickly learned respect for the fuses. American intelligence reports noted that German commanders were offering rewards to soldiers who could retrieve an intact proximity fuse for examination. Prisoners of war, when interrogated, repeatedly spoke of the demoralizing effect of artillery airbursts, particularly at night. One German prisoner described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts, for which there was simply no defense. The airbursts had the added tactical effect of cutting enemy communication wires far more easily than ground bursts, further disrupting German coordination. For German soldiers like Klaus Weber, who had opened this story crouching in his foxhole south of Malmedy, the proximity fuse represented something more disturbing than simply another weapon. It represented a fundamental disparity in technological and industrial capability that Germany could not hope to match. When Wehrmacht engineers finally examined the few intact fuses recovered from duds, their assessment was sobering. The miniature vacuum tubes alone were beyond Germany's manufacturing capability at the scale required. The precision components, the quality control necessary to produce millions of reliable units, the industrial coordination to bring together components from over 100 factories. All of it pointed to an American industrial base operating at a level Germany had not imagined possible. German scientists had concluded in 1940 that proximity fuses were theoretically impossible to mass produce. The Americans had not only proven this wrong, but were manufacturing them by the tens of thousands per day. Wehrmacht technical intelligence reports noted that even if Germany could reverse engineer the design, the nation lacked the industrial capacity, the raw materials, and the skilled workforce to produce them in meaningful numbers. This realization spread through German ranks in the final months of the war. It wasn't simply that American artillery had become more lethal, it was that American industry could produce technological miracles, while simultaneously producing overwhelming quantities of conventional weapons, vehicles, and supplies. German soldiers facing proximity-fused fire understood implicitly that they were fighting an enemy with capabilities beyond their ability to match or counter. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical casualties. German units began refusing to move during daylight hours when American artillery could observe them. They avoided any position that appeared to be a likely target. Morale plummeted not from fear of death, which soldiers accepted, but from the specific fear of proximity-fused artillery, which provided no chance of survival and no way to fight back. American intelligence reports noted that German prisoners increasingly cited artillery as the primary reason for surrender. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, accomplished not through propaganda, but through demonstrated futility of resistance. The sense of helplessness against weapons that burst overhead with perfect timing broke the Wehrmacht's will to resist more effectively than any leaflet or radio broadcast could have achieved. From December 1944 through the end of the war in May 1945, proximity-fused Allied anti-aircraft fire brought down more than 1,000 German aircraft. In ground combat, proximity-fused artillery shells, calibrated to detonate 30 to 50 feet above ground, took a fearful toll on German forces. Medical personnel examining German casualties reported that wounds from proximity-fused shells tended to be more severe than wounds from conventional artillery. The shrapnel came from above, targeting the head and shoulders. Multiple fragment wounds were common. The lethality was significantly higher. The effectiveness statistics told a stark story. Against aircraft, proximity fuses required approximately 1/4 as many shells to achieve a kill, compared to conventional time-fused ammunition. A Navy study found that 5-inch guns needed to fire 1,000 time-fused shells for every aircraft destroyed. Proximity-fused rounds required only about 250 shots, This translated to a 4-to-1 improvement in effectiveness. Against ground forces, the advantage was even more pronounced. Traditional artillery relied on ground bursts, which could be deadly in the immediate impact area, but allowed soldiers in trenches and foxholes to shelter. Proximity fuses exploded above defensive positions, showering down shrapnel that penetrated from angles that earthworks couldn't protect against. American artillery battalions reported that fire missions using proximity fuses achieved casualty rates estimated at 5 to 10 times higher than conventional ammunition in the same circumstances. This is where the hyperbolic claim of every fifth shell, a guaranteed kill, finds its origin, though the reality was more nuanced. The proximity fuse increased lethality dramatically, perhaps by a factor of 5 to 10 compared to conventional fuses. But this didn't mean every fifth shell killed an enemy soldier. It meant that proximity-fused shells were 5 to 10 times more likely to cause casualties than conventional shells in similar situations. Against concentrated enemy formations, the results could be devastating. Against dispersed forces, the advantage remained significant but less overwhelming. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures. Electronic jamming was theoretically possible, but required understanding the fuse's operating frequency and characteristics. Without intact working fuses to analyze in detail, German engineers couldn't determine the specifications needed for jamming equipment. Even if they had succeeded, deploying jammers across every potential target would have been impossible given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. Physical countermeasures proved equally ineffective. The fuses operated by detecting reflected radio waves. Reducing the radar cross-section of troops and equipment was impossible. The human body itself reflected enough energy to trigger the fuse at close range. The only defense was dispersion, spreading forces widely enough that a single shell would not catch multiple targets. But dispersion reduced combat effectiveness and made coordinated operations difficult. German tactical doctrine had evolved around concentrated formations that could mass firepower and maintain command and control. Dispersing to counter proximity fuses weakened overall unit capability, even as it reduced casualties. It was a tactical dilemma with no good solution. By March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and advance into Germany, proximity-fused ammunition had become standard for all American artillery. Factories were producing fuses faster than they could be shipped to Europe. The industrial achievement was remarkable. From the first working prototypes in 1942 to mass production at millions of units per year took less than 3 years. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during the war, each containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. The total cost exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, roughly $15 billion in today's money. This made the proximity fuse program one of the most expensive technological developments of the war, rivaling even the Manhattan Project in scale and cost. The investment proved worthwhile. Post-war analysis by military historians identified the proximity fuse as one of the key technological advantages that shortened the war in both Europe and the Pacific. In the Pacific theater, the proximity fuse's impact was even more pronounced than in Europe. Naval forces relied heavily on anti-aircraft defense against Japanese aircraft, particularly during the kamikaze campaigns of 1945. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition could engage suicide aircraft at longer ranges and with higher kill probabilities. The fuses were credited with preventing ship losses that would have significantly delayed operations and cost thousands of additional lives. During the Battle of Okinawa, the destroyers Hadley and Evans, along with supporting vessels, faced a 90-minute assault by 156 Japanese aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed dozens of attackers. Both destroyers survived despite multiple hits. Personnel aboard credited the proximity fuses with making defense possible against such overwhelming numbers. The technological legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond military applications. The miniaturization techniques developed for the program influenced the entire electronics industry. Before the war, electronics were handcrafted by skilled technicians. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that complex electronic devices could be mass-produced by systematically breaking construction into simple, repeatable tasks. These manufacturing methods became standard practice in the post-war electronics industry. The quality and control systems developed to ensure fuse reliability influenced manufacturing across multiple industries. The concept of statistical process control, where production quality is monitored continuously rather than inspected after completion, was refined during fuse production and became foundational to modern manufacturing. The workforce training programs demonstrated that complex technical work could be performed by workers without advanced education, given proper training and well-designed procedures. This insight shaped post-war American industry's approach to technical manufacturing. The space program, the development of computers, and the transistor revolution all drew on knowledge and techniques developed during the proximity fuse program. The scientists and engineers who worked on the fuse went on to distinguished careers. James Van Allen became one of the founding figures of space science, discovering the radiation belts around Earth that bear his name. The rugged electronics he developed for proximity fuses directly influenced the design of instruments for early satellites. Merle Tuve continued leading scientific research at the Carnegie Institution. Dozens of others joined universities, industrial laboratories, and government research facilities, bringing expertise in miniaturization, electronics, and systems engineering. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about resources, priorities, and the different paths nations took through World War II technology development. Germany invested heavily in advanced weapons like jet aircraft and ballistic missiles. These were impressive achievements but came too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. America invested in technologies that could be mass-produced immediately. Proximity fuses, while sophisticated, were designed from the start for mass production. Every decision in their development prioritized manufacturability and reliability over theoretical performance. The result was a weapon available in overwhelming numbers when needed. This reflected a fundamental difference in strategic thinking. Germany sought war-winning superweapons that would offset Allied numerical superiority. America sought effective weapons that could be produced in quantities that made numerical superiority overwhelming. The proximity fuse was not a superweapon. It was a very good weapon produced in very large numbers. That approach proved decisive. In the final accounting, the proximity fuse represented everything that made American industrial power dominant in World War II. It combined advanced technology with practical engineering. It required massive investment but produced proportionate results. It was sophisticated yet manufacturable, effective yet affordable at scale, innovative yet reliable. The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused fire understood this implicitly. Wehrmacht veterans interviewed after the war consistently described the fuse not merely as a clever weapon, but as a demonstration of comprehensive superiority in science, industry, and national will. The proximity fuse didn't end their war through any single dramatic defeat. It ended through the accumulated weight of countless engagements, each proving the same lesson. They were fighting an enemy with capabilities beyond their ability to match or counter. That realization, more than any battlefield loss, broke the Wehrmacht's spirit and hastened the end of the Third Reich. Klaus Weber survived the war. In interviews decades later, he recalled that morning south of Malmedy when he first witnessed proximity-fused artillery. He remembered not just the terror of the airbursts, but the profound understanding that followed. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or its weapons lacked power, but because America possessed industrial and technological capabilities that rendered conventional resistance futile. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.